When you watch the mainstream media news, do you feel a little twitch? Is there a tingle in your left hand? Is your jaw locked? We have the solution. Welcome to Reasonable Arguments, the podcast where thoughtful debate meets unfiltered fun. Coming to you from Sarasota, Florida, where your hosts, Jamie Miller and Jennifer Bash, make sense of the chaos. Together, we mix informed conservative commentary, playful banter, and just the right amount of nonsense to keep it entertaining. This is Reasonable Arguments, and now your hosts, husband and wife duo, Jamie and Jennifer.
We are
Hey, babe.
in our new podcast studio.
What a great job you've done on this. Holy mackerel.
Hopefully this podcast will actually be the one that works.
I sound like Leave It to Beaver. Holy mackerel.
Since we've tried this, I think this is our third time trying this, but hopefully this time will be the one that takes.
Well, we've had at least 3 different locations inside the house that we've tried.
Yeah, that's true.
So
That's true.
this is the one that you've spent the most time on, and it looks the best.
Thank you. Thank you. So for those of you who aren't watching, you might want to go to YouTube and check us out because it's
Very
kinda
cool.
nice.
Yeah.
All right. So today I wanted to talk about, because I don't know what we were watching on TV, one of the news stations or something, and I asked you about, what is the true difference between Democrats and Republicans? Because when I registered to vote in 2016, right, I wasn't voting for Trump because he was a Republican. I was
Right.
voting for him because of truly against Hillary.
Yeah.
Truly. And just because I felt he would tell me the truth, whether I liked it or not.
Right.
And I registered as independent. So, and I can honestly say at that point, like, I don't think, I know I didn't know the true background of Democrat and Republican.
This is 9 short years ago. And now you're wearing a Republican hat.
This was a gift from my friend Linda for Christmas, and I love this hat.
Republican hat. You've been to the Republican National Convention, and you sent me a text this weekend. And it went something like, "I hate you. I'm now not only watching about politics, I'm reading a book about politics."
Yeah, that's dumb. That's dumb.
What happened?
I don't know. I guess it's all interesting because I'm obviously supporting your passion in politics, and I'm learning. I think, because of what we're trying to do here, let's go back to the basics. So let's talk about the true difference between Democrats and Republicans and how has that changed over years?
Yeah.
Really.
I
Right?
mean, Republicans signed the Emancipation Proclamation and freed slaves. Democrats formed the KKK, and it wasn't until 1964 that you saw a huge transition of African Americans to the Democratic Party with the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act and the explosion of social programs, which were supposed to help people who had been disadvantaged. And those disadvantaged communities in the mid 1960s are still the worst disadvantaged communities today. So,
Yeah.
60 years later, Democrats have nothing to show for those types of things. I know that's not the topic, but that's a short transition of how,
Yeah.
just one difference in how Democrats and Republicans changed over time.
Okay. So what we're going to break down is really what Democrats generally support, same as Republicans. We're going to use a real world example, and we're going to give an example of how it helps people and hurts people.
Okay.
And then, of course, we'll ask you questions along the way. So, all right. So let's start out with healthcare.
And I'll probably interrupt you.
I'm sure.
Yeah. So
I'm sure. Yeah. Okay. So Democrats want government supported healthcare, which is like Canada. And although I've heard Canada's great because you don't have to pay for healthcare, you have to wait for months, right? You have to, you have a bad knee, you're limping around. You may not get in to see an orthopedic for 6 to 8 months because that's just how it goes.
It's worse than that. You could need open heart surgery and have to wait
Yes.
6 or 8 months.
Yeah. Okay. So Hold that thought. So the example that we're going to talk about is Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, which made it so more people could get health insurance even with pre-existing conditions, which is great. The positive of that was that more people could afford doctor visits and prescriptions. It helps a single mom working two part-time jobs get Medicaid for her kids. The negative is, again, that it's long wait, it's red tape, and fewer choices in some areas.
And you forgot one major factor. It's super expensive on taxpayers. Super expensive. It's probably some of the most expensive healthcare in the world. So, Barack Obama was a very good politician. And so the two things that he led with, he brought the Affordable Health Care Act in a couple of parts. The first part had two things. The one that you mentioned, pre-existing conditions, which most people are like, listen, it's kind of crap if I lose my job and have a pre-existing condition. My next job's health insurance doesn't cover me. So, and the truth of the matter is, health insurance is insurance companies are able to cover that payout if they know they have to have it, right? So that's an adjustment of numbers. And the other thing that was really popular was that children could stay on their parents' policies until they were 26 years old. And so those were the first two parts.
Children.
Well, they said
at 26 years old.
Well, the thought was if somebody was in college, they went and got their master's, their PhD, they should be able to do that within 8 years after being 18. So that's how they came up with the age of 26. Although, we know adulthood starts at 18 legally. I've argued many times that all things adults should be 21, including the draft. You should be able to volunteer before you're 21. But you should not be able to be drafted until you're 21, but you should not be able to vote until you're 21. Gun ownership, all those things, drinking, all those things that become adult things, smoking should all be 21, in my opinion. But we actually have a constitutional amendment that says it's 18. The right to vote is 18. So, without a change in the Constitution, which I don't think there's political will to do, even if there's, people who agree.
You're going off track.
There. All things adults should be 21.
Okay.
So, but as far as the Affordable Health Care Act, it's super expensive, and that was the argument for it, against it at the time. That's still the argument. And while people can get coverage, it's really expensive.
Okay. So the Republicans prefer private health plans with less government interference. And the example of that is the Trump era push to repeal Obamacare and allow more stripped down, cheaper insurance plans. The positive for that is you have more choices and less government control. And it helps small business owners find a flexible, lower cost private insurance plan. The negative is no salary net. So if you lose your job or have a pre-existing condition, which they give the example of a 26-year-old with diabetes loses coverage and racks up medical debt. But, insurance companies, regardless, have always had, not all of them, but a lot of them have had pre-existing condition clauses in them for as long as I can remember.
Yeah.
And I started it, in healthcare when I was 20 years old. So I don't really think that that's anything new, but you have all these people out there selling insurances now. And I know a lot of it's based on your income. And is that Obamacare?
Well, the things you see on television are people trying to sign up for, get people to sign up for Obamacare. The low cost health care. So much of it is people, there's not a whole lot of options for what I would like to insure. Just like our house, we don't insure every cracked window or every shingle that's lost. We cover catastrophic losses.
Yeah.
So we get those prices down. It's the same thing with healthcare. I would prefer to pay full price for prescriptions, pay full price for doctor visits, and cover myself with catastrophic care and get that health insurance cost down so that, cover me for the things that I cannot withstand financially.
But a lot of that could be prescriptions.
But
I
we
mean,
we
look at the price of insulin.
yeah, but you could still cover some of those things if you built it into your family's budget, right?
Yeah.
Insulin's an outlier, but and a very hot political topic. But most prescriptions you can get through, for your blood pressure, you don't have to take the newest drug. You can take the generic, those cholesterol, there's enough cholesterol medicine, all the things that most people are taking most of the time are available in generic at lower cost anyway. And you have, I mean, Publix offers a list, our local grocery store here in
But that
Florida.
doesn't mean that they would still do that.
That doesn't mean they would still do it, but they use some prescription drugs as a loss leader to get people in their store, the same way a 7-Eleven might use gasoline to get people inside the store to buy their milk at a higher price.
Yeah.
And so there's a list of a lot of drugs that our local, I say local, statewide southeastern United States Publix grocery store provides to people regardless of insurance for free. Antibiotics, go down the list of things that it's cheaper sometimes to not apply your insurance at Publix.
Yeah.
And so, so there are all those things that come into play. So some of it's choice. I think Obamacare actually limits people's choices. It's great for those who have long-term permanent health problems, which we should have covered a different way. We could have, I always advocated, why do we need a fourth federal healthcare system? We have Medicare, Medicaid, the VA, and now Obamacare. So
Well, you always had that because you had commercial. It was commercial.
And they have commercial insurance on top of that, right? So but as from a federal government standpoint, we as citizens should provide a safety net to those who are less fortunate. That's something Americans believe in. Obamacare was kind of painted too broad a swath to try to take over and control people through healthcare, and it'll eventually march that way. I mean, it's still only been the law of the land for about 12 years.
Right. So the next one we're going to talk about is money and taxes. Who gets taxed and how much? So Democrats want to tax billionaires more to fund public services. Example is Biden's proposed billionaire minimum tax to make sure the ultra rich pay at least 20%. So the positive of this is more public services and support to working families. The tax credit could help something like the earned income tax credit or the American Opportunity Credit for educational expenses. These credits reduce the amount of tax you owe and increase your refund. Now, the negative is higher taxes may make small businesses tighten hiring or cut hours. Just take, for example, a bakery owner that lays off a worker just because to cover rising payroll taxes. So on the Republican side, Republicans want to push tax cuts to encourage job creation. Example is Trump's 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which lowered corporate taxes to 21%. The positive is let people keep more of what they earn. This helps middle income couples see a bump in take home pay. The negative is fewer government resources when things go south.
So there's a lot to unpack there. First is billionaires. Second is tax cuts versus credits. And then finally, the allocation of resources, government resources. So number one, there's not enough billionaires to get the United States out of its financial hole. If you took the 800 or 900 billionaires, I think in the world, but let's say they're in the United States, 800 to 900 billionaires, and you took
I'm listening. I'm just going to
100% of their money. You took 100% of their money, it'd be about $6 trillion, which is not even enough money to run the federal government for 1 year. So to say, oh, we're going to tax billionaires, it's very popular. I'm not against billionaires paying, quote, their fair share or paying taxes if they're paying them.
156 billionaires in the United States in 2023.
Okay. So 800 to 900 billionaires in the United States. If you took everything that they have, 100% of their assets, it's $6 trillion.
Yeah.
Which is less than our operating budget for 1 year. and we're 36, 37 trillion dollars in debt. So, so to tax them at 20% of their income every year is not going to solve whatever problem that Democrats are saying it's going to solve. Should billionaires pay taxes? Yes, everybody should pay taxes, and everybody does, whether you pay sales taxes, but they're talking specifically about income taxes. So, and I have advocated as tax day looms for the rest of the country. For Florida, it is been kicked to May since the hurricanes, but as tax day looms for everybody, I have said that the IRS should have to send us a bill, send every citizen a bill, and you only have to file a tax return if you disagree with that bill or refund. So if the federal government in January says, "Hey, Jamie and Jennifer, here's what we think you owe the federal government on top of what you already paid," and it's $10,000, and we go to our accountant and say, "The government wants $10,000," and the accountant says, "No, the government owes you $3,000." Okay, now it's worth paying an accountant $2,000.
Yeah.
To have a $13,000 swing, right? And so that would also cut a lot of red tape from government. It would cut the IRS, and certainly the IRS using AI certainly knows within a couple $100 what every single W-2 employee in the United States.
But you have to be a W-2 employee.
And I would suggest that even for 90% of small business owners like us who aren't making millions and millions of dollars, that the IRS could probably peg our taxes within $500 using AI and using our history and knowing, they know your bank accounts. They know when you have transactions of more than $5,000.
Yeah.
All of those things they know. So, if you have, now last year you had 10 transactions of 5,000 or more deposits, and this year you have 50.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you might need to do your taxes. You might need to file taxes, but no, the important part here is no citizen should lose their freedom, their personal or financial freedom, because of federal taxes. Nobody should have to go to jail or be financially ruined because they said to the government what they owe, and then years later the government says, "No, we disagree with you. Now we're going to audit you and we're going to punish you." That onus should be on the government, not on the taxpayer.
Yeah, and I mean, there has to be like a statute of limitations and things like that.
Sure,
too,
there's
right?
a statute. It used to be 7 years, now it's 3 or whatever. But the point is, the government, no citizen should lose any freedom,
yeah,
because they messed up their taxes, either on purpose or not. It is the government's responsibility. It's not the way it is. I believe it's the way it should be.
right.
It's the government's responsibility to tell me what I owe, and then me file a tax return if I disagree. And then there we can have a discussion about, if I'm cheating on my taxes or not.
Yeah.
But if I just agree with the government, there's no way I would lose financial or personal freedom.
Yeah, that's true.
So we have taxes there. What was the second issue in your list? The third one's coming to mind with
the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
So no, the second thing was tax cuts versus credits. So this is just a big load of BS that Democrats try to pay. So 50% of Americans pay no taxes. Think about that. 50% of Americans pay no taxes, zero taxes. And so they come up with statistics like, well, 60% of taxpayers.
Why aren't they paying taxes?
Because they don't make enough money. They're people who receive welfare. They just don't. They pay no taxes. They don't reach the threshold to pay taxes, and so you have, and so you end up with these things called tax credits. So the big one is the earned income tax credit. It is used for mostly poor, lower income single parents who have children. They get what's called an earned income tax credit. So they pay no taxes, And then on top of that, the government sends them a refund on top of any welfare they may receive, any other assistance they may receive. So Democrats try to completely blur the line of tax cuts versus tax credits. So, of course, only the top 50% of people or 60% of people are going to receive a tax cut. If there's only the 40% are paying taxes in a range that would make a difference, right? So they like to skew those numbers so that, like, oh no, all these folks who are filing tax returns to get tax credits are then, somehow in the mix and should get more tax cuts. Well, if you're not paying taxes, you should not get a tax cut.
Yeah.
So what they're talking about is increasing. When they say credits, they're talking about increasing welfare programs for the most part, and they're talking about increasing, not welfare. Maybe that's maybe too rude a word. People get upset about that, but assistance programs.
Okay.
And then the third and final thing was on your list was what?
That was it. I think the hurricane, right?
Yeah. So the third one is they claim, that we can't have tax cuts because FEMA will go away, or pick any type of, the tax credits will go away. And this is what we're finding out through Doge is a lack of a commitment to allocation of resources to proper federal government functions.
Yeah.
And so Democrats have spread these, quote, functions of federal government across a much broader spectrum of things than is the responsibility of the federal government. FEMA's not in the Constitution. We've kind of set that up as something that we as Americans have decided to do, and some states handle it better than others. We saw that difference between the hurricanes here in Florida and the fires out in California.
Yeah.
Yeah, everyone's like, oh, hurricanes hit Florida all the time. Well, so do fires hit California all the time. So how do you have 140 fire trucks that aren't in service during the dry period? Like it's, so it's just a lack of government resources, a lack of government planning that I don't want to say caused the fires, but certainly led to it being a greater disaster than it could have been. And so they want to argue that tax cuts hurt that. Well, what really hurts that is electing Democrats who are incapable or unwilling to allocate resources to the proper place.
Okay. The next one we're talking about is climate and energy. So Democrats push green energy. The example is Biden's Inflation Reduction Act included billions for solar, wind, and electric vehicles. The positive is long-term cleaner air, safer water, and green jobs. It helps a laid-off coal miner retrains and gets a job in solar panel installation. The negative is short-term energy costs rise with new regulations, and that hurts a family's utility bills skyrocket during winter. The Republicans prefer fossil fuels to keep costs down, and the example is Trump expanding oil drilling and pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. The positive is keeps fuel affordable and supports current energy jobs, helps a trucker save money at the pump and keeps more of his paycheck. Negative is slower climate action can lead to more disasters, floods, fires, etc. And this can hurt a coastal town that deals with repeated hurricane damage and insurance spikes.
Yes. So here's this is all red herrings, in my opinion. Number one, Democrats have never proven outside of very liberal think groups that have come up with somehow humans create climate change. So do we add to it? Probably. I'm willing to accept that. Sure, we can, but we can't burn enough fossil fuels to match a volcano. And there's multiple volcanoes erupting annually around the globe. And so there's really not a logical, to me, this is a logical thing and a follow the money in a lot of cases. Should we use solar? Sure. If it can be done efficiently. Right now, it's not done efficiently. You use about 300 or 400 acres to power about 30 homes or whatever it is. And so there's not enough land to put enough solar panels to make a difference. If you really want to talk about clean energy, you have to talk about nuclear. And the only problem you have with nuclear is storing the waste after it's created the energy. But that's the cleanest energy available. That's the most non-intrusive energy we can create. And environmental activists say, oh no, we can't do that either. So it's more about lining the pockets. And solar in particular, we've gone through about 10 or 20 years of solar panels going on people's roofs. All of these components are made in China. And I know we're going to get to tariffs a little later, but the solar panels are a perfect example of the Chinese government undercutting every American country to flood the United States and the world with solar panels that are nobody can compete with it because the communist Chinese government complements that effort. So you end up with all these Chinese components, and they've cornered the market on it, run everybody. It's kind of like Walmart in a small town. Walmart comes in and they then run all the small businesses out because they lower their price. Their prices are lower when they first show up. And then after everybody's out of business, they can move their prices up 5, 10, 15% to match their other stores.
Yeah.
So it's not it certainly is not like this is correct and this is wrong. As far as fossil fuels go, that is, there's not a police force, an ambulance, fire truck. They're not running these off of electric vehicles because guess what? When there's no power after a hurricane or during a crisis, you need gas. And so, and the one thing that nobody spoke about during this whole electric vehicle explosion of the, Biden administration was that, at some point, like nuclear waste, these electric vehicle batteries are going to become the nuclear waste of the 2030s.
Right.
And so you're going to have to do something with them. And they keep saying, oh, we're going to recycle them. And yet we can't do that now. And so, no, technology is going to catch up with it. Okay, well, let's see. Technology won't catch up to it until there's profit.
Yeah.
And so nobody's going to do that until there's profit in it. And, my guess is you end up with people taking these batteries in a lot like China took our recycling in. Oh, we'll take your plastic, and then they dump it in the South China Sea. They don't recycle it. They just dump it. And so
Probably using it to make something.
no, they're not. They're just dumping it. We pay them to take it, and then they just dump it. It's like telling somebody who works for the mob to come and take your old refrigerator, and they take it out to the railroad tracks. They don't take it to the dump. They take it to the railroad tracks and dump it. So so this is all kind of a Democrats like solar and wind is completely irrational. You're killing migratory birds, and these are people who support the environment. You're killing federally protected migratory birds. You take more oil to use those than the electricity than if you burned the oil and created electricity with them. So that is completely a farce. And then to continue the upkeep of windmills, it's just there's no reason to have windmills at all. Solar, you can kind of make the argument, but then you're taking up hundreds of acres of land for what? Yeah, and it's farmland.
Yeah.
And once you have it there, you're not going to pull those things up and start farming again.
Right.
And so we're compromising our ability to grow crops for solar. And in that regard, I don't agree with it.
The next thing we're going to talk about is immigration, which we have talked about. We have an immigration series that I think we have one more person we're doing interviewing this week.
We have a fifth person who is asked to come and speak. We're becoming very popular, Jennifer.
Good. Finally.
Yeah, we are. Our own sheriff, Kurt Hoffman, has asked to come on the podcast because he would like to talk about how these immigration policies are being implemented at the local level.
Oh, okay.
And talk about what he has learned from the Florida Sheriff's Association. So
Okay,
from
great.
his fellow sheriffs and what they're doing to implement the president's policy and what we're doing right here in Sarasota County to implement that policy. So I think that's going to be a great exclamation point on, for our final fifth.
Yeah.
We're doing the fourth one next week, and we'll probably do the fifth one the week after.
Okay, great. All right. So immigration, Democrats have more lenient policies. The example is the DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, let people brought here as kids stay and work. The positive is it's open doors for skilled workers, students, and families in need. It helps a nurse from abroad fill a hospital staffing gap in rural America. The negative is poorly managed systems can overwhelm local resources. It hurts a small town schools and clinics are stretched thin with sudden population growth. Republicans focus on border security. Example is Trump's border wall and remain in Mexico policy for asylum seekers. Positive is focus on border security and preventing illegal entry. This helps a border town sees a drop in cartel related crimes. And the negative is strict policies can split families or turn away needed workers. A farm can't find legal seasonal workers and loses a harvest. I really I get the idea for, needing the workers and stuff like that because we have such a hard time with anybody wanting to work in this country, especially after COVID. It just kind of everybody just kind of, found something else to do that they don't have to get out and work. And so I understand that. But then after talking to the people that we have had on our show, the 3 interviews that we had about, how destructive the population gets just more and more and more and more. And, then you have the immigrants that are hurting people and the sanctuary cities that are causing problems and all of these things.
So one of the interesting things that came out of our first 3 conversations was that, we're at a point of bringing in enough legal immigrants, forget about illegal, and legal immigrants are about 1.1 million per year versus the illegal that we know were somewhere around 8 to 10 million over the last 4 years. So we probably have 14 million immigrants over the last 4 years. And so the last time we had that kind of percentage influx was, the Ellis Island years. And what we realized was that we were changing the fabric of America because people weren't assimilating, and they really didn't have the American experience. And so they, and like-minded people connect with like-minded people. They connect with their churches. They connect with their communities, and so they create kind of their own pockets of America. And so there's not, a true patriotic American experience. So, and that is one of the real downfalls of what we're trying to do. Because if we're going to remain America and the beacon for the rest of the world to look at for freedom, we have people who come here have to assimilate into that freedom-loving, patriotic country. They can't come and say, oh no, this is how we did it here and that's what we're doing. Now, we also know that the difference between legal and illegal immigration through this series has been that the differences are vast, and so we want to try to continue to keep those 2 differences separated. We know that illegal immigration has dropped a great bit, but prior to Biden's horrible open border policy, most illegal immigration were people who flew here. They had a visa and they overstayed their visa.
Yeah.
And so they entered the country legally, but then stayed illegally, and for any number of reasons. But so the difference between Democrats and Democrats presumably don't care about the fabric of America. They don't care about having traditions and patriotism if they're supporting this huge number of illegal immigrants that come across the border. Forget about the number of gangs and the number of Americans who've been killed, and just the horrors, Boston, time and time again, trying to say, oh, well, we're just going to let people out with, on, on parole for free after they've committed a sexual act against a child. And what like what so I think those are some long-term policies Democrats are going to have to they're going to have to explain and live with. And, of course, Republicans tend to be more law and order, more, um, hey, let's have some immigration, but let's know who's coming. Number one, let's know where they are
Right.
and know what they're going to do. Are they going to stay, or are they coming here for like an education and to leave? And so those are the major differences. Democrats are just like, come and vote. Like that's what it appears.
Yeah.
And, I don't know if I think ultimately, parents who are here, just like we're seeing in, prior to Barack Obama, the young African Americans were registering Republican at historic. That's why Democrats had to go with Barack Obama in 2008. They had to stop young African Americans from registering Republican. So we had the Barack Obama years, and then now we're starting to see that again. We started to see that in the Hispanic community as well. The interesting thing is in the Cuban Hispanic community, that specific demographic, the younger people started. That the older generation is very Republican, and the younger generation started, if you want to say rebel, became more Democrat until Trump. So, and now the younger Cubans are kind of re-registering Republican. So that's a super fascinating dive into demographics we can do. Probably an entire podcast on it. Might be the most boring podcast for people ever. I see your eyes glazing over, but I love you anyway. Thank you for listening.
Okay, so the next one is social issues, rights, morals, and hot topics. So Democrats support progressive values. The example is support same-sex marriage, abortion rights, and transgender protections. The positive is it's a push for equal rights and personal freedoms. It helps a trans teen feel safe and protected by state laws. Negative is policies can spark backlash or feel forced in conservative areas. Hurts a religious small business owner gets sued over not providing certain services. Republicans favor traditional values, example, state level abortion bans post Roe versus Wade and laws restricting gender affirming cares for minor. Positive is it protects traditional values and religious liberty, helps the family feel more aligned with their values being represented in school policies. And the negative can be exclusionary or limit rights for others. Hurts same-sex couple is denied healthcare benefits or adoption rights.
So, I have throughout my career fallen more on the libertarian side on a lot of these social issues. The problem with the Democrats is they have to decide if they're going to be progressive or extreme radical liberals. And they've chosen so far extreme radical liberals. Bernie Sanders, AOC wing of the party, let children decide to self mutilate. You won't allow a child to get a tattoo that's permanent, but yet they advocate that a child should be able to determine whether or not they should have permanent sexual reorientation, and that just makes no common sense. And so they've got some real struggles within their party on some of those things. As far as I was concerned, when it came to gay marriage, I always thought that the gay community should have worked it from end of life issues, because both my parents retired from hospice, and they solved.
What do you mean worked it from end of life?
Instead of talking about marriage, talk about end of life issues. So, because marriage is such a loaded word, it stirs up the religious right, because it has to do with the church, and only a church can marriage. Really, the only reason why government should be involved with marriage is for the reallocation of resources and the protection of children during divorce. So that's the only government responsibility for marriage. And so what the government, what the church does is marry people. The government kind of oversees a divorce. And so I always just said, the gay community, back in the 60s, 70s, women couldn't get a mortgage by themselves, which is like crazy when you think about it, right? Like nobody would support that now.
Right.
But gay couples couldn't get married, couldn't get mortgages together. You and I were able to get a mortgage before we were married, and so together. And so, which is, at the 1970 or whatever year it was a pretty radical idea. And so what ended up happening, the practical application is you would have gay couples who were married for 30, 40, 50 years. and they would have one person would be on the mortgage. So one person owned the house. And so let's say that's the person.
But they weren't technically married.
They weren't married because gay people couldn't get married. And so if that person, let's say, came down with cancer and died, there were many instances of the family that ostracized that gay person, hadn't spoken to that gay person in decades, and yet the family came in and went before a court and said, I'm the heir, not the person who helped pay for the house, not the person who lived and supported that person through their life and death, and it was crazy, like the government shouldn't be involved in that, and so I always just said if the gay community could have had quote marriage 10 years earlier, if they had talked about end of life and how gay people were denied equal protection under the law, really, during end of life issues. So
I'm not understanding what you're meaning by that.
when somebody dies, like, so,
Oh, just with the house situation.
you're right. So, but there were, let's say you have a business, you're in the business together, but the loan and the business is under one name.
Yeah.
But you have, and so it was, so I'm very libertarian when it comes to that. The problem is now the LGBTQ plus community has taken that and put it on steroids, and they're trying to deny parents the right to parent their child. When a child says, oh, I'm 7 years old and I'm a different gender.
Yeah.
Which is crazy. Like that's crazy that some teacher could step in and somehow suggest that that teacher has more rights over a child than a parent.
Right.
And I don't think anything in our founding documents would suggest that. And so, so that's kind of where we are on that particular social issue. Abortion rights, this is Roe versus Wade is very interesting because people are like, it was established law. Roe was not established law. It was a court decision. And we had 50 years, liberals had 50 years to encode Roe in law, and they never did it because there was never the political will or ability to put it in law. And so when Dodd came around, and we know that any entity can undo their own thing. If Congress passes something, Congress can reverse it. If if a president's executive order, a future president can change it. A Supreme Court decision, a future U.S. Supreme Court decision can reverse it. And so, so there's this. Democrats also say, oh, well, this is established law. And we've argued all along. I've argued that I'm pro-choice for personal and emotional reasons, and I try not to get into those with anybody at any time. But I also know that there are people who are pro-choice for personal and emotional reasons, and I'm not right because of my personal and emotional reasons, and they're not wrong, but they're not right because of their personal and emotional reasons and make me wrong. If it's on the ballot, I'm going to go vote my way. They're going to go vote their way, and the most votes wins. And so that's just kind of the way I've handled that throughout my career. But I have always advocated that it is a state rights issue, and that Roe, undermined states' rights, and that's exactly what happened. And that's what the Dodd decision was all about. It wasn't necessarily about abortion; it was about states' rights.
Okay. The last one that we have is foreign policy. So Democrats prefer diplomacy and alliances. Example is Biden rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement Act.
That's not true. Everybody's for diplomacy, but go ahead.
Okay, and supporting NATO. If strong global alliances can mean more stability in trade. Farmer exports more crops due to strong international deals. Negative is over-involvement can lead to costly wars or aid packages. Billions sent overseas while bridges collapse at home. Republicans focus on America first. Example is Trump pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal and pushing tariffs on China. Positive is focus on America's needs first. Steel worker gets their job back after tariffs cut imports. Negative is isolation can lead to economic retaliation or instability. A tech company loses revenue as foreign markets pull back.
So yeah, so everybody would rather solve all the world's problems through diplomacy. Nobody's out there saying, "Oh, we'd rather send our children to war than find diplomatic solutions." So to suggest that Democrats have some level of corner on the market over diplomacy is, I think, wrong. But um, if we want to talk about the Iran nuclear deal, Donald Trump pulled America out of the Iran nuclear deal simply because Iran. There's this is controversial that Iran wasn't listening. They weren't abiding by the nuclear deal, and they were still developing ballistic missiles. So while they were maybe technically meeting the red letter of the nuclear deal here, they were still developing the capability to deliver nuclear weapons through ballistic missiles over here, which weren't part of the deal. And so Trump says, well, what's the point? Because if you break the deal, the nuclear deal, you could probably be able to deliver some level of a nuclear device within a few months because you have the missiles to do it. So if you don't include the missiles in the deal, then what's the point of the deal? And so, then you have the issue that we're dealing with now with China. And China has dug in their heels. Certainly Trump has dug in his. The truth of the matter is, China needs to sell us goods. We're going to have goods made other places that are going to deal with us and send us the things we want without tariffs. And so, you have to think about one of the greatest threats to the future of America is China. And yet we have a whole political party and Democrats saying, oh my gosh, we have to continue to trade and finance communism in China. Now think about your grandparents, who went over to World War II or created, I had a grandfather who built hand grenades for World War II, right, on the assembly line. And so he wasn't over there, but he was helping the war effort. Like, can you imagine that? Like, oh, we're going to fight so that our dollars can buy things to finance communism? Like, that makes no sense. And so we're financing the future ruin of the United States unless we either end communism in China, which is not likely to happen, or we end up with some level of a more fair trade. And a lot of these things just need to be built somewhere else. And we need to trade with other people in the world. We talk about USAID. Well, we're trading so much with China. Think of some of that aid that we're doing with some Central African country. If we could have them develop some products, some manufacturing, and ship to us, wouldn't that help them? And that goes back to the immigration issue we touched on a little bit, and we touched certainly with Roy Beck on our last podcast, was use the nurse example, a nurse in a rural hospital from a foreign country. But we took a nurse from a developing country. And so where is that nurse, truly most valuable?
Right.
Would it be in our country or in hers? Assuming the nurse is female. So are we taking, I use the example of, a meeting I was at recently where a doctor stood up and he was from Guyana. And it's like, oh, I bet our country's been I grew up in a village of 200 people and I was a farmer and I was a successful farmer, but everybody thought I was so bright I needed to go to college, and when I became a doctor, and now I'm here in Sarasota, and this country's been so generous to me. It's like, well, are we really doing the most compassionate thing for Guyana by having this doctor in Sarasota instead of Guyana?
Right.
And therein lies the debate.
Okay. All right. Well, that's all I have for today. So, again, we have another immigration interview this week, and then, of course, Kurt Hoffman wants to get in on it, which I think is fantastic.
Yeah, we've had several people who are wanting to join the podcast, babe. So you're doing a great job.
We have the continuation of the Constitution.
Right.
So we got to get back into that. And
we still have Ed Rollins in the queue.
Yeah. So we have a lot coming up. But that's all I have for today. You're good?
I'm out of words. That's me out of words, babe.
All right.
Thank you for making fun of me.
we will
Everybody have
see-
a great week.
We'll see you next time.
This has been Reasonable Arguments, News and Nonsense. There is so much BS on the mainstream media news, but you knew that. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, make sure to like, rate, and review. We'll be back soon. See you next time as husband and wife duo Jamie and Jennifer keep it real on Reasonable Arguments.